What if the most feared dungeon boss in history was not plotting world conquest, but trying to sleep while everyone else ruined his life? Stay to the end, because this lazy monster problem turns into a noble conspiracy, a weakened demon king, and a skeleton announcing something much worse is coming. Spoiler warning for chapters 0 through 9 of this Korean manhwa. The story begins with a legendary dungeon tied to an ancient monster named Swallow, a being feared like a crisis, but the punchline is that the monster himself is not the hyperactive tyrant everyone imagines. Around him are Rene, a devoted white-haired dungeon ruler, and Patrick, a Death Knight skeleton who often feels like the only practical manager left. The early chapters mix dungeon mythology, monster comedy, and political danger, showing how one chaotic boss room can pull adventurers, demons, cities, and nobles into the same disaster. The prologue sells the dungeon like a nightmare before revealing the joke underneath it. Armed figures move through a dark monster territory, speaking as if they are entering the domain of something no human should challenge. A blonde armored swordsman is framed like a heroic conqueror, backed by companions and the confidence of someone used to surviving impossible fights. The chapter then piles on brutal imagery, ruined ground, slaughtered bodies, looming monster shapes, treasure, and a throne-like stairway deep inside the lair. Everything points toward an overwhelming boss encounter. But when the party faces the monster's presence, the legend twists into comedy. The most memorable clue is that people were supposedly overwhelmed by a single yawn, and the final appearance of Rene hints that this terrifying dungeon is run by people far stranger than the stories claim. Chapter 1 explains why dungeons are treated as both disasters and opportunities. Humans fear them because monsters live inside, but they also chase their treasures, glory, and forbidden power. That mythic setup leads us into the present, where Rene sits with Patrick the Death Knight and Swallow, the ancient shadow monster at the center of the dungeon. Rene presents herself as the dungeon's owner and makes the problem clear: the dungeon has been inactive for far too long, and Swallow is supposed to act like a proper boss monster. Instead, he is sleepy, passive, and completely lacking the dramatic menace expected from a legendary creature. Patrick brings stern knight energy, Rene brings obsessive management, and Swallow brings reluctance. When Rene reveals a powerful sword and pushes him to grow stronger, the dungeon's true conflict begins, restoring a terrifying legend with a boss who would rather nap. Chapter 2 starts by framing the black-haired boy as someone monster-like followers already treat with importance, even if his own role is still mysterious. A pale green-eyed girl watches him carefully, and a glowing magical object near the dungeon setting suggests that his presence is connected to deeper dungeon power. He then moves from the dark interior toward a brighter outside world, shifting the story from closed dungeon comedy into a larger fantasy society. The focus moves to a small hooded girl in a lively settlement, where traders or adventurers handle glittering magical stones. A red-haired woman and robed figures gather around several gems, including a dramatic heart-shaped red jewel that becomes the center of a tense but funny negotiation. The chapter does not fully explain the jewel's nature, but it clearly matters enough to pull the dungeon's business into the outside world. Chapter 3 begins in a library with a confrontation instead of a battle. A glasses-wearing young man challenges Rene and Lord Snaillow, accusing them of hiding the truth and mentioning an ancient hidden dungeon. His anger matters because it turns the goofy boss monster setup into a question of manipulation: who knew what, and who was used. The story then shifts toward castle ambitions, with a huge red-black fortress and a demonic atmosphere suggesting Snaillow's reach is not limited to one room. Rene, meanwhile, undercuts the darkness with exaggerated devotion, praising Snaillow's appearance and asking about conquering the castle. Then the tone snaps back to politics. Byrne is declared dead, nobles discuss forbidden ancient power, and Nifrim is blamed. But Byrne is not simply gone. He appears tied to a resurrection-like experiment, waking in a monstrous state and questioning whether this fate is now unavoidable. Chapter 4 throws a battered young man into survival mode. He wakes alone in a monster-filled dungeon after trying to protect Rene, and his first clear motivation is simple: he does not want to die. The strange part is that his body no longer behaves normally. Even injured and confused, he can move, dodge, and react with ability beyond an ordinary human. A small white companion-like figure appears as he explores, and the cave around him is full of fleshy, predatory monsters. When a human-eating creature attacks with tendrils or plant-like strikes, he counters and realizes this is less a random nightmare than a brutal tutorial. By the end, he has enough control to defeat the beast, but the reunion with Rene is not peaceful. A shadowy presence gathers around her, hinting that his new body and her protection are tied to danger still closing in. Chapter 5 puts Patrick in the spotlight, and the joke is that even a terrifying skeleton knight can look overworked when stronger monsters are involved. He tries to act menacing in a dungeon filled with purple energy, but the scale of the threats around him makes his authority feel fragile. A massive shadowy boss presence looms over him, and Patrick is forced to move fast rather than simply posture. He navigates chaos, red smoke, glowing objects, and a battlefield where pink crystals or magical loot are left behind. After the title break, the tone slides into comedy as Patrick deals with a black-haired young man and the consequences of everything going wrong. The crucial point is that the situation is dangerous enough that if the true boss fully understands what happened, the results could become apocalyptic. Patrick is not just guarding a dungeon anymore, he is delaying catastrophe. Chapter 6 moves the conflict toward Hastin, a name tied to either a place, a target, or both. A small black-haired figure watches from a rocky wasteland with a skeletal bat-like attendant, waiting until hostile forces are within range. A dark magical strike then erupts across the canyon, turning the terrain into a trap. The story cuts to a throne room where a horned purple-haired boss monster sits like a demon lord, treating the attackers beneath her as a joke. Armed intruders and their captain attempt to push forward with weapons, shields, light, and ice-like magic, but her purple-black power overwhelms them again and again. The battle becomes smoke, rubble, and scattered survivors. When the black-haired young man appears amid the aftermath and someone asks where Hastin is, the story shifts from defense to pursuit, because the battlefield has not answered the real question. Chapter 7 begins after the destruction, with Ronnie waking or emerging near surviving demons. A purple-winged demon woman sees his human-looking form and makes the mistake of treating him as harmless, possibly a low-ranked lesser demon. That assumption becomes the chapter's trigger. Ronnie is confused, still focused on finding Hastin, and not interested in being ranked by appearances. When the demon woman boasts about her own higher status and orders an attack, Ronnie's irritation finally breaks through. He releases a terrifying shadowy power and crushes the surrounding enemies or monsters so decisively that the conversation changes instantly. After that display, he introduces himself as Devd Ronnie, but instead of acting like a conqueror, he awkwardly asks for directions. The answer is bad news. Hastin may no longer be reachable, and the nearest clue seems to be the city of Ray Eyes. Chapter 8 slows the pace into town comedy while quietly loading the next threat. Ronnie travels through a lively nighttime settlement with the small purple-haired horned girl and a pale spirit-like companion. The girl is loud, proud, and eager to show off her power, while Ronnie stays guarded and unimpressed. They enter a crowded tavern or guild-like inn, the kind of place where food, drink, rumors, and job notices all mix together. The purple-haired girl eats and drinks with childish excitement, then eventually falls asleep at the table, leaving Ronnie to deal with the practical consequences. He studies the posted notices and chooses one, but the imagery connected to that request is far darker than the tavern's warmth: a monstrous shadow, a fortress, weapons, fire, and a threatening figure. By the end, the innkeeper and patrons confront Ronnie over trouble or damage, trapping him between debt, work, and danger. Chapter 9 opens with Ronnie waking in a bedroom and finding the purple-haired horned girl in his bed, now much smaller than before. She is groggy, angry, and embarrassed, while Ronnie reacts like anyone would after discovering a tiny demon girl where he expected peace. When he points out her childlike size, she snaps back, insisting this is not her true body. Ronnie connects the change to the massive power she used earlier, suggesting she burned through too much strength and was reduced as a result. She explains that this is a lower version of herself, not a real loss of identity, and that more power lets her shift into stronger forms. Their awkward comedy is interrupted by larger events. Forces arrive from the capital because of the primordial core, and a letter from the third prince drags the Count of Tark into the crisis. The second half of Chapter 9 turns the morning joke into political pressure. The Count of Tark, Sir Hastin, receives a notice in the third prince's name and reacts with anger, because the letter demands investigation into the attack, the monster core, and the person responsible. His subordinates try to discuss what happened around the primordial core, but the Count is more concerned with blame, reputation, and whether the force behind the incident can truly breach the dangerous place. The chapter then introduces a white-haired visitor connected to the Count of Stark, whose calm attitude feels more threatening than respectful. He claims his purpose is not simple negotiation, and his words imply mass killing or a ruthless purge. The ending shifts to darkness, violence, and a skeletal armored figure announcing that the hour has nearly arrived, turning the next conflict into something much bigger than tavern damage. These opening chapters work because they keep flipping the expected power fantasy. Swallow in the dungeon should be terrifying, but the people running it are lazy, obsessive, exhausted, or wildly impractical. Ronnie looks human, then proves he is far more dangerous than his appearance suggests. The purple-haired demon girl looks like a child after spending too much power, but she still carries the attitude of a boss-level threat. Meanwhile, the nobles treat the primordial core as a political weapon, not just a monster problem. That contrast is the hook: comedy inside the party, catastrophe outside the door. By Chapter 9, the story has moved from dungeon maintenance to city-level fallout, with the third prince, the Count of Tark, the Count of Stark, and a coming skeletal threat all circling the same mystery. And that is the early arc recap for this chaotic Korean webtoon. If you want the next part, subscribe, because the lazy boss monster problem is only getting more dangerous from here.